In 1736, a Massachusetts woman named Rachel Martin appeared before her neighbors with visible bruises covering her face and arms. Her husband, Thomas, had beaten her severely again. But when Rachel begged for help, the response she received wasn't what you might expect. The town selectmen told her to return home, pray for patience, and remember her marriage vows. A husband has authority over his wife, they explained. Unless he threatens her life, the matter is between them and God. Rachel wasn't unusual. Across colonial and early America, countless women, and some men and children, suffered brutal violence within their own homes. Yet in a world without police officers, domestic violence hotlines, restraining orders, or shelters, victims had almost nowhere to turn. So how did early American communities respond to domestic abuse? The answer is deeply troubling. Most of the time, they didn't. When they did intervene, their methods ranged from public shaming rituals to community violence that sometimes rivaled the original abuse. This is the disturbing story of domestic violence in early America, a hidden crisis that communities acknowledged but rarely addressed, leaving countless victims trapped with no hope of escape or protection. To understand how early Americans handled, or failed to handle, domestic violence, we must first understand the legal and social framework of marriage and family in the colonial and early national periods. Under English common law, which formed the basis for colonial American legal systems, marriage created a legal doctrine called coverture. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't sue or be sued, and had no legal right to her own earnings or even to her children. As the influential English jurist William Blackstone explained in his 1765 commentaries on the laws of England, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. This legal framework had profound implications for domestic violence. Since husband and wife were legally one person, and that person was the husband, violence within the marriage was conceptually difficult to prosecute. A man couldn't assault himself. Contrary to popular myth, there's no evidence that English or American law ever formally established a rule of thumb, allowing husbands to beat wives with sticks no thicker than their thumbs. However, the law did recognize a husband's right to use moderate correction, or chastisement, to discipline his wife, similar to his right to physically discipline children and servants. What constituted moderate versus excessive correction remained vague and highly subjective. Massachusetts Bay Colony law stated in 1641 that every married woman shall be free from bodily correction or stripes by her husband, unless it be in his own defense upon her assault, appearing to ban wife-beating entirely. Yet court records show that magistrates rarely enforced this provision unless injuries were life-threatening or permanently disfiguring. A 1655 Maryland case clarified the prevailing attitude. After a man severely beat his wife, the court declared that moderate chastisement was acceptable, but this particular beating had exceeded the bounds of moderation. The husband was fined but not jailed, and the wife was sent home with him. Early American society drew sharp distinctions between public and private spheres. The home was considered a man's castle, a private domain where his authority was nearly absolute. Neighbors, church officials, and magistrates were reluctant to interfere in domestic affairs unless violence became so extreme or so public that it threatened community order. This privacy doctrine meant that what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. Women couldn't easily seek help without publicly shaming their families and themselves. The social stigma of admitting to marital problems often outweighed even severe physical danger. Colonial and early American communities lacked professional police forces until the mid-1800s. As covered in previous scripts in this series, law enforcement consisted of part-time constables, volunteer night watches, and sheriffs primarily focused on tax collection and court administration. These amateur systems were poorly equipped to handle domestic violence even when communities wanted to intervene. Constables had no training in managing domestic disputes. Magistrates lacked the authority to issue protective orders or remove abusive spouses from homes. Jails were primitive and used primarily for temporary holding before trial or punishment, not for protecting victims. Moreover, women had limited economic independence. Most couldn't own property, earn wages, or support themselves outside marriage. Even if authorities removed an abusive husband, the wife and children would likely face destitution. This economic reality made intervention seem impractical or even cruel to the victims it was meant to protect. Without formal law enforcement or protective systems, early Americans relied on informal community mechanisms to regulate behavior: gossip, reputation, public shaming, church discipline, and neighborhood pressure. These mechanisms worked reasonably well for maintaining public order and addressing crimes that disrupted community life, but they failed catastrophically when applied to domestic violence. The same privacy norms that protected family autonomy shielded abusers. The same respect for patriarchal authority that structured colonial society made challenging a husband's treatment of his wife seem radical or inappropriate. And the same community cohesion that enabled informal justice also enabled collective denial. Everyone knew abuse was happening but agreed, implicitly or explicitly, to look the other way. Into this framework, legal subordination of women, privacy of the home, absence of police, economic dependence, and community reluctance to intervene, domestic violence flourished, largely hidden from historical records but devastating to countless individuals and families. One of the earliest and most thoroughly documented domestic violence cases in colonial America began on February 8, 1673, in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, when 73-year-old Rebecca Cornell was found dead in her burning home. Initially presumed an accident, the circumstances soon suggested something far more sinister. Rebecca Cornell was a prosperous widow living with her son Thomas Cornell and his family. Court records and witness testimony reveal a household marked by constant tension and violence. Multiple neighbors testified that Thomas frequently abused his elderly mother, both verbally and physically. One neighbor, Mary Briggs, testified she had witnessed Thomas strike his mother and frequently threaten her life. Another witness, John Briggs, reported that he had seen bruises on Rebecca's arms and face on multiple occasions. When he asked about them, Rebecca allegedly said, "My son Thomas uses me thus." Yet despite community awareness of the abuse, no one intervened to protect Rebecca. On the evening of February 8, Thomas claimed his mother had been sitting too close to the fireplace and her clothing caught fire. He said he tried to save her but couldn't prevent her death. The local authorities initially accepted this explanation. However, Rebecca's brother, suspicious of the circumstances, requested that her body be examined more carefully. The examination revealed that Rebecca had died not from burns but from a mortal wound to her abdomen that did pierce through her body. The burn marks had been inflicted post-mortem, apparently in an attempt to disguise murder as an accident. Thomas Cornell was arrested and tried for matricide, killing one's mother, considered one of the most heinous crimes in Puritan society. The trial in May 1673 was sensational for its time. Prosecutors presented the testimony of neighbors who had witnessed years of abuse, establishing a pattern of violence that made murder seem inevitable. The jury convicted Thomas Cornell, and on May 23, 1673, he was hanged. His execution was notable not because domestic violence was taken seriously. The crime that mattered was murder, particularly matricide, which shocked Puritan sensibilities. The years of abuse Rebecca suffered were mentioned only as evidence of Thomas's violent character, not as crimes in themselves. The Rebecca Cornell case illuminates several disturbing realities about how early Americans handled, or failed to handle, domestic violence. Multiple neighbors knew Thomas abused Rebecca. They witnessed it, yet none intervened or reported it to authorities. This passive awareness characterized most domestic violence in early America. Everyone knew, but no one acted until someone died. Authorities prosecuted Thomas for killing his mother, not for years of beating her. Domestic violence itself wasn't considered a serious crime. Only when it escalated to murder did the legal system respond. Several women testified about what they had witnessed, providing evidence that secured Thomas's conviction. This suggests that while the formal legal and social systems failed to protect abuse victims, women in communities sometimes tried to bear witness and seek justice after the fact. Rebecca was a property-owning widow with resources. This likely made her death, and the inheritance issues it raised, matter more to authorities than the death of a poor, propertyless woman might have. The case became famous partly because of a bizarre supernatural element. Several witnesses claimed Rebecca's ghost appeared to them, showing her wounds and naming her murderer. While modern readers dismiss this as superstition, it reveals something important. People needed to believe divine justice would intervene where human justice had failed. Communities did respond to domestic abuse. They employed public shaming rituals designed to humiliate the abuser and pressure him to change his behavior. One such case occurred in Essex County, Massachusetts, in 1672, involving James Harris, a blacksmith repeatedly accused of beating his wife, Elizabeth. Court records indicate that neighbors complained multiple times about James Harris's treatment of his wife. Several testified to hearing Elizabeth's screams coming from the Harris home. One neighbor, Goodwife Parsons, stated she had seen Elizabeth with a blackened eye and swollen face, injuries Elizabeth attributed to her husband. The church deacons initially attempted private intervention, visiting the Harris household to counsel James on proper Christian behavior toward his wife. These interventions apparently failed. The abuse continued. Finally, after a particularly severe beating left Elizabeth unable to work for several days, the town selectmen decided to act. Rather than bring criminal charges, which were rare in domestic violence cases, they ordered a public shaming. On a designated Sunday after church services, James Harris was made to stand in the town square for 3 hours wearing a sign around his neck that read, "This man beats his wife." Community members were encouraged to pass by and verbally rebuke him. According to court records, Harris was much mortified by this experience. Additionally, the church congregation temporarily banned Harris from taking communion, a serious spiritual punishment in Puritan society that carried social consequences as well, marking him as someone whose behavior was so unacceptable that he was unfit to participate in sacred rituals. There's no follow-up record indicating whether this public shaming actually stopped James Harris from abusing his wife. Court records show no further complaints, but this might mean the abuse continued privately, and Elizabeth, having seen her husband humiliated and potentially enraged, was now too afraid to seek help again. This uncertainty highlights the fundamental problem with community shaming as a response to domestic violence. It might change behavior, or it might simply drive abuse further underground while increasing danger for the victim. The James Harris case illustrates several important aspects of how communities attempted to address domestic violence through informal mechanisms. Communities preferred humiliation and social pressure to formal legal proceedings. This reflected both the difficulty of prosecuting domestic violence and a belief that community pressure was more effective than law. Religious institutions played a central role in regulating behavior. Exclusion from communion was meant to both shame the offender and threaten his eternal soul, creating spiritual incentives for reform. While intended to punish the abuser, public shaming also humiliated the victim. Elizabeth Harris now lived in a community where everyone knew her husband beat her, knowledge that carried stigma for her as well as him. The community's response did nothing to protect Elizabeth if the shaming enraged James or made the situation worse. She was sent home to the same man in the same house, with no safety measures in place. The selectmen would only go so far. They wouldn't remove James from his home, arrest him, or help Elizabeth leave. Their intervention preserved the marriage structure and the husband's authority while attempting to moderate his behavior, a fundamentally limited approach. While most victims of domestic violence had no escape from abusive marriages, a tiny minority of women, usually wealthy or well-connected, attempted to obtain legal separations or divorces on grounds of cruelty. These cases reveal both the possibilities and extreme limitations of legal remedies for domestic violence in early America. Abigail Bradford's petition for divorce from her husband John, filed in Massachusetts in the 1750s, provides a detailed window into one woman's desperate attempt to escape an abusive marriage through legal means. Abigail and John Bradford married in 1745. According to Abigail's later testimony, John began beating her within months of the wedding. The abuse escalated over the next several years. Abigail's petition describes incidents including being struck with fists repeatedly about the head and body, being kicked downstairs while pregnant, having her arm twisted until dislocated from the shoulder, being threatened with a knife, being locked out of their house in winter weather, being deprived of adequate food. Court records indicate that Abigail came from a relatively prosperous family. Her father was a merchant, which gave her unusual resources. Many abused women had no family to return to and no means of supporting themselves outside marriage. In 1753, after 8 years of marriage, Abigail filed a petition with the Massachusetts colonial legislature seeking a divorce from bed and board, legal separation on grounds of cruelty. Massachusetts law, slightly more liberal than most colonies, did allow divorce in exceptional cases, though it remained extremely rare and difficult to obtain. Abigail's petition had to meet an extraordinarily high burden of proof. She needed to demonstrate not merely moderate correction, but life-threatening violence, corroborating testimony from credible community members, proof that she hadn't provoked the abuse through her own misbehavior, evidence that she had attempted reconciliation and sought separation only as a last resort. Abigail provided testimony from 3 neighbors who had witnessed John beating her on multiple occasions. One neighbor, a midwife, testified that Abigail had been so badly beaten while pregnant that the midwife feared for both mother and child. A physician testified to treating Abigail for a dislocated shoulder and broken ribs. Critically, Abigail also had to demonstrate her own proper conduct. Multiple witnesses testified that she was dutiful, pious, and of good moral character, that she had fulfilled her wifely duties and given John no cause for reasonable correction. After nearly 2 years of proceedings, the Massachusetts legislature granted Abigail a divorce from bed and board in 1755. This allowed her to live separately from John and protected her from being forced to return to him. However, the terms were limited. She could not remarry. Divorce from bed and board wasn't a complete dissolution of marriage. She received no alimony or financial support. She had no custody rights to any children, though the Bradfords apparently had none. John retained control of any property that had been hers before marriage. Abigail returned to her father's household, where she lived as essentially a dependent spinster for the rest of her life. While she had escaped the immediate physical danger, she remained legally and economically bound to her abuser, unable to fully rebuild her life. Abigail Bradford's case illuminates the narrow legal options available to domestic violence victims in early America. Only women with family resources could pursue legal separation. Poor women had no access to this remedy. Abigail needed multiple witnesses, medical documentation, and proof of life-threatening violence. Lesser abuse, even severe beatings, wouldn't qualify. The system scrutinized the victim as much as the abuser. Abigail had to prove she was blameless, a standard that disqualified many real victims who had defended themselves or fought back. Even successful petitions provided no real independence. Separated women couldn't remarry, often received no financial support, and remained legal dependents. Massachusetts was one of the most liberal colonies regarding divorce. Most colonies and states didn't allow divorce on grounds of cruelty at all. Even in Massachusetts, only a handful of divorce petitions succeeded annually. The fact that Abigail Bradford's case was considered remarkable enough to be documented and discussed suggests how exceptional it was. For every Abigail Bradford who escaped through legal means, thousands of women remained trapped in violent marriages with no hope of relief. The failure to address domestic violence in early America had profound and lasting consequences that shaped family structures, gender relations, community dynamics, and legal development. Perhaps the most damaging impact was the complete normalization of intimate partner violence. When communities consistently failed to intervene in even severe abuse, when legal systems explicitly granted husbands rights to correct wives, when churches preached wifely submission and patience in the face of cruelty, the message was clear. Violence within marriage was acceptable, even expected. This normalization affected not just adult relationships, but children's understanding of family dynamics. Children raised in violent households learned that male authority was enforced through physical dominance, that women had no right to safety or bodily autonomy, and that community authorities wouldn't protect the vulnerable. These lessons were then transmitted to the next generation, perpetuating cycles of violence across generations. Court records from colonial New England show that men convicted of wife-beating often had fathers who had also been accused of abusing their wives. While not definitive proof of intergenerational transmission, it suggests that witnessing domestic violence as a child normalized it as adult behavior. The acceptance of domestic violence both reflected and reinforced women's subordinate legal and social status. If a woman had no right to safety within her own home, what rights could she meaningfully claim anywhere? The doctrine of coverture, which gave husbands legal control over wives, property, earnings, bodies, and children, made logical sense only within a system that viewed women as essentially incompetent to manage their own affairs. And that presumed incompetence was enforced through violence or its threat. Historians have documented that legal reforms expanding women's rights often met resistance framed in terms of domestic order. Opponents of married women's property rights in the 1840s-1850s argued that allowing wives independent property ownership would encourage them to resist their husband's authority, leading to family breakdown. The implicit threat: without the leverage of total economic control, husbands might need to use more violence to maintain authority. The community response, or lack thereof, to domestic violence created a culture of complicity. Neighbors who heard screams and saw bruises but did nothing, magistrates who dismissed complaints, church leaders who counseled submission rather than protection, all became implicated in the violence they failed to prevent. This complicity had moral and psychological costs. Communities that tolerated domestic violence were forced to construct narratives justifying their inaction. Perhaps the wife deserved it, perhaps she exaggerated, perhaps it wasn't as bad as it seemed, perhaps it was none of their business. These rationalizations protected not just abusers but the community's self-image. The few cases where communities did intervene reveal the psychological burden of complicity. In the Rebecca Cornell case, multiple witnesses expressed guilt that they hadn't done more to protect her. This suggests that many community members recognized domestic violence as wrong but felt powerless or unwilling to act until tragedy made inaction impossible. The failures of early America's response to domestic violence had long-term institutional consequences. The legal doctrine that a man's home is his castle, originally about limiting government power, became a barrier to protecting abuse victims well into the 20th century. Police departments, once finally established, inherited the reluctance to intervene in domestic disputes. treating them as private matters rather than crimes. It wasn't until the women's rights movements of the 1970s, 1980s that domestic violence was reconceptualized as a crime requiring legal intervention and victim protection. Even then, reforms faced resistance rooted in centuries-old assumptions about family privacy, male authority, and women's subordinate status, assumptions established and reinforced during the colonial and early national periods. The historical legacy of ignoring domestic violence thus extended far beyond the colonial era, shaping legal doctrines, law enforcement practices, and social attitudes that persist, in some forms, even today. The disturbing reality of domestic violence in early America, and communities' failures to adequately address it, offers unsettling parallels to modern challenges and ongoing debates about intimate partner violence, victim protection, and the role of law enforcement. Even after professional police forces were established in the mid-1800s, they inherited early America's reluctance to intervene in domestic violence. Through most of the 20th century, police officers were trained to treat domestic disputes as private matters requiring mediation rather than criminal investigation. Officers would calm things down and leave, rather than making arrests or documenting injuries. This echoes colonial constables' reluctance to interfere in a husband's treatment of his wife. The underlying assumption remained the same. What happens between spouses isn't really the business of law enforcement. Reform came slowly. Only in the 1980s, 1990s did states begin adopting mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence calls. Studies showed that these policies reduced repeat violence, but also revealed persistent problems. Officers still sometimes failed to make arrests. Victims faced economic hardship when abusers lost jobs due to arrests, and the criminal justice system remained poorly equipped to actually protect victims long-term. Today's legal system offers restraining orders or protection orders, documents that theoretically prohibit abusers from contacting or approaching victims. These represent a significant advance over early America, when no such protections existed. Yet protection orders face limitations reminiscent of colonial-era problems. They're just pieces of paper, effective only if police can and will enforce them. Numerous high-profile cases have involved victims murdered by abusers who violated protection orders, sometimes after victims had called police multiple times reporting violations that weren't treated as serious threats. The gap between legal protection on paper and actual safety mirrors the gap between colonial laws theoretically banning wife beating and the reality that such laws were rarely enforced. Abigail Bradford's inability to achieve true independence after legal separation, remaining economically dependent on her father, reflects challenges that persist today. While women now have legal property rights and employment opportunities colonial women lacked, economic dependence remains a primary reason victims stay in or return to abusive relationships. Victims without independent income, without credit history, without affordable housing options face choices eerily similar to those colonial women faced: stay with an abuser or face poverty and potential homelessness. The establishment of domestic violence shelters in the 1970s, 1980s addressed this somewhat, but chronic underfunding means many shelters turn away victims for lack of space, and most can't provide long-term housing solutions. Perhaps the most direct parallel between early American and modern responses to domestic violence is the persistence of the bystander effect. Neighbors who hear violence, who see evidence of abuse, but don't intervene or report. Modern research shows that neighbors frequently don't call police during domestic violence incidents, citing reasons that echo colonial attitudes. It's not their business. They don't want to interfere in a private matter. They don't want to make trouble for neighbors. They assume someone else will call. The same community complicity that allowed Rebecca Cornell's abuse to continue unchallenged operates today, enabled by technology, soundproofed apartments, and social atomization rather than explicit privacy doctrines. The progress is undeniable. Domestic violence is now recognized as a crime. Specialized police units and courts address it. Shelters exist. Legal protections are available. Women have property rights, economic opportunities, and legal standing colonial women couldn't imagine. Yet the fundamental challenge remains. How do we effectively intervene in violence that occurs in private spaces, between people in intimate relationships, in contexts where victims often have economic or emotional ties to abusers? How do we balance respect for family privacy with the duty to protect the vulnerable? How do we convince communities that intervening is their responsibility? These questions haunted early Americans. They haunt us still. The story of domestic violence in early America is a story of systemic failure. Legal systems that subordinated women and children to male authority, economic structures that made independence impossible, social norms that prioritized family privacy over individual safety, and communities that chose complicity over protection. Rebecca Cornell died because everyone knew her son abused her, but no one intervened until murder made inaction impossible. James Harris's wife endured public humiliation alongside her abuser when the community finally acted. Abigail Bradford achieved legal separation only because she had unusual resources and was willing to sacrifice any hope of independence or remarriage. And for every one of these documented cases, thousands of nameless victims suffered and died in obscurity, their stories lost to history because domestic violence was so common, so accepted, that it seemed unremarkable. We've made progress. Women have legal rights, economic opportunities, and social standing that would have been unimaginable in colonial America. Domestic violence is recognized as a serious crime. Support systems exist that early Americans couldn't have conceived. Protection orders, shelters, hotlines, and specialized courts represent genuine advances in victim protection. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that domestic violence remains disturbingly common. According to the CDC, approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Every year, hundreds of victims are murdered by current or former intimate partners despite restraining orders, police reports, and court interventions. Neighbors still fail to call for help when they hear violence. Economic dependence still traps victims in dangerous situations. The question early Americans faced: how do we respond to violence within families when victims are legally, economically, and socially subordinated to their abusers? Hasn't been fully answered even today. We've eliminated the legal subordination, expanded economic opportunities, and created support systems. But the core challenge remains. Domestic violence occurs in private spaces, between people in complex relationships, in contexts where victims face enormous barriers to seeking help or leaving. Understanding how early Americans failed to address domestic violence, and why, helps us recognize similar patterns today and recommit to doing better. What do you think? How do modern responses to domestic violence compare to the historical failures we've explored? What more could communities do to protect victims and prevent intimate partner violence? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you found this historical exploration important, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into how early Americans dealt with crime, justice, and social issues before modern institutions existed. Check out our previous videos on public executions, legal loopholes, and community-based justice systems. And if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, or visit the hotline.org. Help is available.